She was betrayed by her own family. But she chose to forgive. Muskan's awakening. There are people in this world who are like flowers, radiant yet fragile, blooming in the chaos of life without knowing which gust of wind will come to tear their delicate petals apart. Muskan, her name itself felt like a sweet blessing bestowed upon her life. It meant smile. She grew up in a small village, where misty mornings welcomed the chirping of sparrows and golden rice fields stretched endlessly like sunlit silk carpets beneath the sky. Muskan was strikingly beautiful. But hers wasn't the proud beauty of storybook princesses, nor the blazing kind that demanded every eye in the room. Her beauty was pure, like a dewdrop resting on a lotus leaf, like a burst of laughter on a summer noon, like eyes filled with trust in goodness itself. Everyone in the village spoke of her. That girl, she's like spring sunshine, warming even the oldest hearts. When she smiles, it's as if every sorrow just melts away. And so, her parents, Jamal and Nafisa, gave her that name, hoping her smile would forever be a guiding light in their lives. But perhaps, even God tests his most beautiful creations. Muskan lived in a simple, humble household, poor, yet overflowing with love. She was raised amidst her mother's lullabies and her father's stern but loving wisdom. Even as a child, Muskan cared for her younger siblings, helped in the kitchen, and even wove fishing nets so her father could earn a living by the river. Every step she took seemed to be sewn with golden threads of innocence. But when she reached the age of blossoming, the way people looked at her began to change. Those innocent, admiring gazes began to twist, laced now with desire, hunger, and silent longing. Whispers began to circulate. That girl, she's going to stir up a storm someday. Whoever marries Muskan, it's like being blessed for 3 lifetimes. Her parents understood, a precious gem left unguarded would soon be dulled and dirted by the world. And so, an early marriage was chosen, a safety net, a fortress to protect their daughter's purity. There was no question. No afternoons where Muskan sat beneath the banyan tree dreaming of love. Just one simple evening, inside their modest mud brick home, her father said, "My daughter, I have found a good home for you. He is the son of an old friend, from a noble, respectable family. You'll be happy." Muskan lowered her head, biting her lip. Her eyes, as clear as still water, trembled with silent ripples no one could see. Happy. With a man she'd never met, in a home she had never known. But Muskan had never been taught to challenge fate. That night, she sat quietly under the roofed porch, gazing at the starlit sky. The pale moonlight brushed her face with a silvery sheen, as if even the heavens sensed the storm quietly building, ready to shatter her fragile peace. Then came the wedding day. The entire village woke as if from a long slumber, buzzing with drums, laughter, and brilliant lights. Muskan's wedding. She wore a glowing yellow sari like golden sunlight, her dark hair braided with delicate jasmine flowers. Everyone gasped. She looks like a fairy, so beautiful. But only she knew. Beneath the makeup, behind the hesitant smile, her heart was trembling. The Mehndi night, a night of dancing, of joyous drums, of sweet blessings. Muskan smiled. She kept smiling. But each smile felt like a shard of broken mirror pressed against her skin. Amidst the celebrations, Soiya, Muskan's childhood friend, appeared. With eyes full of emotion, Soiya took her hand and whispered, "Come with me, Muskan, just one last time. Let's go to the garden, the one we used to play in. One final night before you enter your new life." Muskan hesitated. She looked back at the glowing house, crowded with guests and laughter. But her gentle heart gave in. No one knew, in that tiny, innocent decision, destiny had already written a story with tears and blood. If you're still watching this video and want to know what lies ahead for Muskan, please comment the number 1 below to let me know you're here. If you haven't subscribed yet, I encourage you to do so and turn on the bell so you never miss a video. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful and inspiring content. That night, the full moon hung faintly in the dark sky, a distant omen that no one noticed. Inside the lit-up house, laughter still echoed. Women were busy painting intricate mehandi designs on one another, vines, flowers, threads of fate drawn into symbols of hope and dreams. In the middle of that joyful chaos, Muskan, the bride of the night, wore a gentle smile. But inside, a strange chill crept through her, curling into every cell like a whisper of dread. Soiya, her shawl draped loosely, leaned in close and urged, "Muskan, let's go. Just for a few minutes. To say goodbye to childhood." Her eyes held something Muskan couldn't read, part sadness, part fierce urgency. Muskan turned to look at her mother, happily chatting with guests. Her father, laughing brightly with relatives. Her feet felt like they were bound by invisible ropes. "I can't, it's my mehandi night." Soiya tightened her grip, whispering as if pleading. "Tomorrow, you're gone. We may never see each other again. One last time, Muskan, for me." The drums, the music, the laughter, it all blurred into the background. And in that swirling chaos, Muskan, sweet, innocent, and far too trusting in friendship, nodded. Throwing a black shawl over her shoulders, Muskan slipped silently out the door. The night air was cool, brushing against her fragile skin, making her shiver. Soiya walked ahead, her steps light and quick, like a shadow. Muskan followed, her legs trembling as if stepping into forbidden lands. They passed through silent alleys where flickering oil lamps swayed like ghostly spirits. The moss-covered walls seemed to whisper warnings, but Muskan either didn't hear them, or chose not to. At last, they reached the old garden, the one where, as little girls, they once ran wild beneath mango trees, laughing as rain soaked them to the bone. Now the ancient mango tree stood hollow and bare, stretching its skeletal branches toward the sky like hands begging for help. Beside it, the old canal, once sparkling like silver glass, now lay dark, silent, and cold. Soiya tugged Muskan down to sit beneath the old mango tree. "Let's just sit here for a moment," she whispered. Muskan gave a faint smile, placing her hands gently on her dress, smoothing out the folds, as if trying to restore order to the storm raging silently inside her. The wind stirred softly. The scent of wildflowers drifted in the air. The hum of insects filled the night, like distant, ghostly whispers. Suddenly, Soiya stood up. "Stay here, okay? I forgot something, just 1 minute." Startled, Muskan grabbed her hand. "Where are you going? Don't leave me here." Soiya gently pulled away, hurriedly replying, "Just a moment, trust me." Before Muskan could react, Soiya had vanished into the darkness, leaving her alone beneath the withering tree. Silence began to swallow Muskan whole. She sat still, her body tense like a tightly drawn bow. Every small sound, the crack of a branch, the chirping of insects, the trickle of distant water, stabbed into her heart like tiny knives. Part of her wanted to run. But the other part, the one that still believed Soiya was like family, kept her frozen in place. 1 minute. Then 2. Time dragged on endlessly, like centuries passing in slow motion. Suddenly, footsteps. Not just one. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, as if someone was grinding the earth beneath them. Muskan spun around. In the pale moonlight, a figure emerged. Tall. Gaunt. Eyes sharp like blades. Babar. The name she had tried to erase from memory. The man she never thought she'd see again. The one who once stood before her, made a proposal, and received a blazing slap in return. Babar's eyes glowed in the dark. He smiled, a cold, venomous smile. Finally, the opportunity has come. Muskan stepped back, her foot catching on a root. Her voice trembled. What are you doing here? He moved closer, each step slow, steady, unstoppable, like a nightmare given form. I came, for revenge, he hissed. Muskan began to shake. She clutched at her shawl, as though that flimsy piece of fabric could shield her from the storm about to break. Muskan tried to retreat, but the old mango tree behind her stood like a cold wall, cutting off every escape. Above, the moon was now nothing but a pale, frozen line in the sky, too faint to reveal the hatred twisting Babar's face. The space between them grew smaller and smaller. Muskan opened her mouth, trying to scream, but her throat clenched tight. The only sound she could make was a choked sob. Please don't do this. Her whisper fell into the void. No one heard. No one answered. Only Babar's dry, bitter laugh echoed back. You humiliated me in front of everyone, remember? Tonight. I take it all back. Then, like a violent wind, he lunged at her. His rough hands gripped her delicate wrists, slamming her down onto the cold, hard earth. Her bright wedding dress was now stained with mud. The smell of wet soil and wild weeds choked her, made her want to vomit. Muskan struggled, sobbed, screamed, but her cries were lost in the thick, suffocating dark. Babar held her down, his eyes bloodshot, like a beast consumed by hunger and madness. Scream louder, the louder you scream, the more it excites me. His vile, filthy words cut into her like blades, scarring her spirit deeper than any wound. In that moment, her entire world collapsed. All her dreams of love, of warm family mornings, of waking beside a kind, gentle husband, shattered, crushed into ashes. When Babar tore through her innocent wedding gown, it felt like he ripped her soul apart. She wasn't herself anymore. She became something else, a breathing shell, a stain no one could ever wash away. The Mehundi night, which was supposed to be filled with wishes and joy, became the blackest nightmare of her life. When it was over, Babar let her go, like a man finished with his fit of madness. He stood up, wiped his mouth, and sneered. Now we're even. You took my honor, and I took everything from you. Without a second glance, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Muskan crumpled on the cold earth. Her wedding dress was in shreds, her hair tangled with dirt, her face streaked with tears and blood. Muskan lay there, motionless, like a broken doll tossed aside. Her empty eyes stared up at the sky. The moon still shone. But now, it seemed more like a mocking spotlight, watching, but offering no mercy. All around her, silence. Even the wind held its breath. Somehow, Muskan got to her feet. Every step ripped through her body. Every movement was agony. She stumbled forward, barefoot over sharp rocks, but felt no pain, not anymore. Step by step, She returned to the house lit up with joy, where people were still singing, dancing, celebrating the happy bride. No one knew, the bride had already died inside her own Mehndi night. At the threshold of her home, Muskan stood still for a long time. Her trembling hands pulled her shawl tighter, trying to cover the wreckage of her body. She lifted her chin, took a deep breath, and swallowed her tears. She had to act. She had to pretend everything was fine. She had to smile. She had to smile. Just like the name her parents gave her. Muskan, smile. That entire night, Muskan sat curled in a corner of the room, hugging herself. Shame. Agony. The suffocating fear of being discovered, all of it churned together into a violent storm inside her soul. But she didn't cry. She couldn't. Her tears had dried up. Only soft, muffled sobs escaped, breaking apart like shards of glass falling onto cold stone floors. The next morning, as birds sang the arrival of a new day, Muskan stood before the mirror. The girl staring back at her was a stranger, with dry, lifeless eyes and a hollow gaze. She dressed in her deep red wedding gown, did her makeup, brushed her hair, adorned herself with jewelry. She wore a flawless disguise. To everyone else, she was a stunning bride. Only she knew, beneath the shimmering surface, all that remained was ashes. That morning, sunlight pierced through the cracks in the doors like sharp needles, landing on the red carpet that blanketed the house. Everyone was rushing about, busy with wedding preparations. Laughter rang out endlessly. Congratulations filled the air. Everyone believed this was the happiest day of Muskan's life. Only Muskan, wrapped in her glorious wedding dress, her face painted like a goddess, knew she was attending the funeral of her own heart. Her mother, Nafisa, gently adjusted her necklace while choking back emotion. "My daughter, you look as radiant as the full moon tonight. You must be happy, my love." Muskan smiled. A perfect smile, fake and frozen like a wax mask. Her mother stroked her hair. Those hands, the ones that once cradled her as a child, that once shielded her from nightmares, could not save her now from this living nightmare that had no end. The sound of drums and horns filled the air. The groom's party had arrived. Muskan was led out, her head covered with a deep red veil, red like blood. Through the sheer fabric, she saw a sea of people. Bright faces, admiring eyes, sweet words dripping like honey. She saw the groom, Sarfaraz, standing across the wedding carpet in a regal sherwani embroidered in gold. A tall man, composed, but his eyes revealed a flicker of unease. Muskan walked toward him slowly, like a sleepwalker. The rituals unfolded like a play rehearsed many times before. Ring exchange. Vows. Prayers. Everyone smiled. Everyone cried, tears of joy. Only Muskan, with each ritual, each prayer, could hear her heart cracking, piece by piece. When her father placed her hand into Sarfaraz's, a sacred symbol of giving away his daughter, Muskan felt herself being torn in two. Part of her wanted to scream, to run away from it all. But another part, the part that had died the night before, whispered, "There's no turning back. Keep walking, even if it's straight into hell." The ceremony ended with applause and celebratory drums. The bride was escorted to her new home in a wedding procession, a glowing stream of cars gliding beneath the evening sun. Muskan sat in silence, surrounded by cheer and laughter, her heart a hollow shell. Through the misty window, she saw golden rice fields and bamboo groves swaying in the wind. The familiar sights that once warmed her soul now drifted like ghosts, haunting reminders of everything she had lost. They reached her new home. A large, imposing house with ivory white walls and a heavy black iron gate. Her mother-in-law, Jamila, stood waiting at the door, holding a silver tray of flowers and holy water. She sprinkled the water around Muskan, spoke blessings, and helped her inside. Each step Muskan took felt like her feet were being pulled into the ground. Each step a chain dragging her deeper into the unknown. Wedding night. The room was draped in red roses, candles casting a soft, golden glow. Muskan sat on the bed, curled up, head lowered, hands clutching her gown tightly. Every passing second, her heartbeat pounded in her chest like thunder. She knew this moment would shape her fate. She feared Sarfaraz's eyes. Feared his first touch. Feared the explosion of secrets she had buried so deep. The door creaked open. Sarfaraz walked in. He sat down in front of her, his eyes filled with a sorrow that couldn't be named. The air was thick and suffocating. Two souls sat across from each other, both carrying wounds too heavy to speak aloud. Finally, Sarfaraz spoke, his voice hoarse. "Muskan. I'm sorry. I don't deserve you." Muskan lifted her head, confused, looking at him. Sarfaraz clenched his robe, as if wrestling with a pain too raw to utter. I'm not a complete man. I can't be a father. I am infertile." In that moment, Muskan's world collapsed again. She sat frozen. Her mouth opened, trying to speak, but her throat was dry and bitter. Sarfaraz's words sliced through the air. Not just hurting himself, but carving deeper into Muskan's bleeding soul. So, this was destiny. Two people bound not by love, but by secrets, by shame, by scars too deep to be seen. Muskan looked into Sarfaraz's eyes. She saw no contempt, no demand, only a silent plea for forgiveness. And in that strange, quiet moment, between two broken souls, an unspoken agreement was born. "I will keep your secret, if you keep mine." The wedding night ended in silence. No intimacy. No kisses. No words of love. Just two broken souls lying beside each other in the dark, quietly mourning the dreams that had died. Days passed like slow, silent rivers, cold and ceaseless, carrying Muskan farther and farther away from everything she once associated with happiness. Since that fateful night, Muskan and Sarfaraz had shared a roof, but between them stretched a vast distance, greater than any ocean. They were husband and wife in name only. In truth, they were two ghosts inhabiting the same room, haunted by secrets and buried in shame. Muskan woke early every morning. She swept the floors, cooked meals, washed clothes, like a silent shadow. No one complained. No one scolded her. Even her mother-in-law, Jamila, would occasionally offer rare praise. "Muskan's a good girl, takes care of the house well." But Jamila, with her sharp, perceptive eyes, had also noticed one thing. This new bride, as radiant as a full moon, had a light that had completely faded. In the early days, Jamila still tried to probe. Why is this girl always so quiet? A newlywed should be chirping like a bird. Sarfaraz would force a weak smile, dodging the question. Muskan would bow her head, clutch her dress, and stare silently at the floor. No one knew her soul was now just a vast, barren emptiness. At night, Muskan lay on the cold, wide bed. Sarfaraz faced the wall, his back to her. The room stayed pitch black, the only sound was the wind outside, occasionally whistling like a cry from another world. She missed home. Her mother's gentle voice. Her father's kind smile. The warm kitchen, the sunlit afternoons. But Muskan knew she couldn't return. If she did, she would carry only shame and pain back with her. She had to stay. Had to endure, even if every breath felt like it tore at her flesh. A month after the wedding, Sarfaraz, with a grim, distant face, began staying away more often. He made excuses: work, business trips, responsibilities in other cities. Muskan never asked. She didn't even wonder. Between them, there was nothing left to question. Nothing left to explain. Every time Sarfaraz walked out the door, Muskan simply watched. Still as a statue, neither happy nor sad, without complaint. Jamila was different. She noticed. She saw that every time her son returned, he avoided Muskan's gaze. She saw how Muskan grew thinner, paler, her once beautiful face wilting, her eyes sinking into bottomless shadows. Some nights, Jamila would stand quietly outside the couple's bedroom door and listen. No laughter. No conversation. Just a heavy silence, so thick it seemed to choke the very air. One morning, while Muskan was quietly sweeping the courtyard, Jamila walked up and stood with her hands on her hips, tilting her head. "Hey girl, why do you walk around like a ghost all day? Is something wrong?" Muskan looked up and offered a faint, lifeless smile. "No, mother. I'm fine." But Jamila wasn't fooled. She scoffed and muttered, "Fine, huh? Even the wind cries for a fate like yours." Day after day, Muskan lived the same way. Alone in a massive house, with pale hospital-like walls and endless hallways echoing only wind. She became a shadow, drifting through other people's lives without leaving a trace. One day, Sarfaraz came home. He held a suitcase, his face weighed down with fatigue. He said nothing. He went to the room, packed a few things, then sighed. "I have to leave. A friend had an accident. I need to take care of him in the next city." Muskan nodded. No words to stop him. No well wishes. Because, how could she hold on to a heart that was never hers to begin with? The door closed behind Sarfaraz. Muskan stood in the empty foyer, silent for a long while. Afternoon light cast long shadows on the faded floor. And inside her, only one question echoed over and over. Am I still alive, or already dead? One evening, the wind began to howl. Dark clouds gathered like fists overhead, warning of an approaching storm. In the small kitchen, Muskan sat huddled in a corner, clutching the edge of her dress. Cold sweat ran down her back, even though the air was chilled. She had felt it for days now, sudden dizziness, waves of nausea. At first, she thought it was exhaustion. But as the sickness lingered, day and night, a vague panic began to take root in her heart. Jamila, with the sharp instincts of an experienced woman, was the first to notice. One morning, while Muskan was folding laundry in the backyard, Jamila approached with folded arms and a scrutinizing glare. "Why do you look pale as a ghost lately? You're stumbling around like you're seasick." Muskan lowered her head, stammering, I'm just a little tired, mother." But Jamila wasn't so easily dismissed. She grunted. "Come with me. We're going to the doctor." On the way to the clinic, Muskan sat curled up in the back seat, her heart racing wildly. She clutched the edge of her shawl, each breath feeling like a mountain to climb. She didn't dare to think about it. Didn't dare to confront the most terrifying possibility. But deep down, somewhere in her soul, she already knew. She could already sense the tiny life beginning to form inside her. The clinic was small, with faded sea green walls, heavy with the sharp smell of antiseptic. The doctor, a kind middle-aged woman, gently examined Muskan. Then she looked up and smiled. "Congratulations. You're pregnant." Those words, soft as the breeze, hit Muskan like a thunderclap. The world spun around her. The ground swayed beneath her feet. Pregnant. But this child was the result of that nightmarish night. Jamila, standing beside her, clapped her hands with delight. "Alhamdulillah. What wonderful news. Just barely over a month married and already a blessing." She grabbed Muskan's hand in excitement. "I must invite the whole neighborhood for a feast tonight. God has truly answered our prayers." Muskan bit her lip until it bled, forcing a stiff, frozen smile. Inside, her heart shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces. On the ride home, Jamila couldn't stop talking. About baby names, tiny outfits she would sew, and gifts to prepare. Muskan sat in silence, her eyes dry and vacant, staring out the window at the gray, overcast sky. Each cheerful word from Jamila was like a dull blade scraping against her already torn heart. That night, Muskan sat alone in her room, her hand resting on her stomach. It was still flat. No outward change. But inside, a tiny heartbeat had already begun. Muskan broke down crying. Salty, bitter tears streamed down her face, dripping onto her trembling hands. She whispered, to herself, to the child, "My baby. This isn't your fault. It's not my fault either. It's just that fate has been so cruel." 2 days later, Sarfaraz returned. When his mother told him the news, his face immediately darkened. He didn't say a word. Just nodded, a thin smile on his lips. But Muskan saw it clearly. A flash of cold fury in his eyes. That night, after the house had gone to sleep, Sarfaraz entered the room. The door slammed shut behind him with a heavy, hammer-like thud. He stood there, staring at Muskan with eyes like blades. "Why?" Muskan looked up, tears welling in her eyes. Sarfaraz spat out each word, his voice raw and bitter. "Why did you betray me? I trusted you. You promised to keep our secret. And now you're pregnant." Muskan trembled. She didn't know how to explain. Because she hadn't betrayed anyone. She hadn't loved anyone else. She was the victim of a crime. Covering her face, she broke down in sobs. "Please, believe me. I didn't betray you. I'm the one who was hurt." But Sarfaraz turned his back on her, his bitter laugh slicing through the silence. "I'm a broken man. I can't father a child. So tell me, whose baby is it?" Silence. Only Muskan's choked sobs echoed in the pitch-black room. That night, Sarfaraz left. No one knew where he went. Muskan sat by the window all night, holding her belly, whispering, "I'm sorry, my love. I couldn't protect myself. But I swear, I will protect you, with every breath I have left." After that night, in the vast, cold house filled with wind and unspoken silence, everything changed for Muskan. Sarfaraz, once distant and timid, now became like a blade. Every glance, every word he threw at her was sharp and cutting, slicing deeper into her already wounded heart. The next morning, Sarfaraz sat in the living room, staring into nothing. When Muskan brought him tea, he didn't even look up. The cup trembled in her hands, burning her fingers, but she felt nothing. Jamila emerged from the kitchen, beaming with pride. Even distant relatives heard the news and sent gifts. "We must throw a grand celebration." Sarfaraz only sneered. A crooked smile, dripping with sarcasm. When the two of them were alone, Sarfaraz suddenly stood, stormed over to Muskan, and leaned in close. He hissed through clenched teeth. "You'll pay for this filthy game." Muskan flinched, retreating instinctively like a frightened animal cornered. Sarfaraz didn't hit her. He didn't need to. That icy glare of his was enough to kill a piece of her soul each day. From that day forward, Sarfaraz no longer treated Muskan like a human being. He ignored her. No glances. No words. No touch. Each morning, he left the house before dawn. Each night, he returned like an empty shell, silent and detached. The house was filled with laughter from Jamila and the younger sisters. But to Muskan, it all felt like echoes from a distant world. A world she no longer belonged to. One day, Muskan brought a meal into Sarfaraz's room. He looked up, his eyes sweeping over her belly. The place where a tiny life was quietly growing. And coldly said, "Take it away. I won't eat food made by a woman like you." Muskan froze. Her hands shook violently. The tray slipped, crashing to the floor, shattering into pieces. She knelt down, picking up the broken shards silently, as if gathering the fragments of her shattered life. No complaint. No anger. Only the sound of wind shrieking through the windows. Like the cries of lost souls. At night, Muskan curled up on the bed, arms wrapped around her belly. Each time she felt the faintest flutter inside her, tears spilled down again. "My baby. It's just you and me now. We have to live. We have to be strong." Her pillow soaked with tears. Her sleep haunted by restless dreams. The days grew colder, not by weather, but by the atmosphere inside the home. Sarfaraz began openly humiliating Muskan in front of the house staff. He made no effort to hide his contempt. His eyes, his voice, dripped with cruelty. One evening, while Muskan was cooking, her sleeve caught on the pot of boiling water. She screamed in pain. Jamila rushed in, quickly tending to the burn. "You foolish girl. You need to be more careful, especially now, with that baby inside you." Muskan managed a faint smile. "Yes, mother." But inside, only hollow silence remained. Loneliness gnawed away at Muskan day by day. No one noticed. No one asked. Each time she passed by happy couples walking hand in hand, she felt a sharp blade pierce straight through her heart. Why? Why was she the one who had to endure all this? What had she done wrong? She had been a victim. She wasn't at fault. But life didn't care who was right or wrong. Life only judged the result. One day, while cleaning the room, Muskan accidentally came across a letter Sarfaraz had been writing. "I was deceived. I married a filthy woman. And now, I have to live in shame every single day." Muskan collapsed to the floor. The letter was like a sword, severing the final thread of hope she had clung to. That night, she stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. A pale woman with dark circles under her eyes, and a belly beginning to swell. She asked herself, "Is this still me?" And then she placed her hand on her belly. The baby kicked, a soft, subtle reminder. I need you, Mom. We need each other. And in that fragile moment, Muskan understood. No matter how much Sarfaraz hated her, no matter if the entire world turned its back on her, she had to live. She had to live, for this little life inside her. Days dragged on like heavy shadows. Muskan became used to living like a ghost. Silent, enduring, unresisting. Her only anchor was the child inside her. A tiny flicker of warmth in the freezing ruins of her life. One gloomy afternoon, the sky was covered in heavy clouds. The wind howled fiercely, kicking up clouds of red dust. Sarfaraz came home, face tense. He said curtly, "A friend was in a bad accident. I need to get to the hospital." Without even looking at Muskan, he turned and left. Something in Muskan stirred. A strange unease curled in her chest. A cold gust blew through the window, sending chills across her skin. That evening, it rained. A heavy, punishing downpour. Each raindrop struck the earth like a hammer. Thunder and lightning split the sky open, like wounds bleeding across heaven. Muskan sat curled by the window, staring out at the empty courtyard. Then she saw something strange. Sarfaraz, under a large black umbrella, was helping a man into the house. The man was frail, wrapped in bandages from head to toe, limping like a broken shadow. The door creaked open. Wet footsteps echoed through the silent home. Muskan crept into the living room, her heart pounding. And when the warm yellow light revealed the man's face, her heart stopped. Babar. The name she thought she had buried forever. Babar. The man who had stolen her life in one horrible night. The man who turned her into a breathing corpse. Now he sat there. His body crippled, legs in casts, face gaunt, eyes lost. A car crash had stripped away his former arrogance, leaving behind a broken shell. A puppet shattered by the wind. Muskan staggered backward and crashed into a wooden pillar. A wave of dizziness hit her, nearly knocking her to the ground. Babar saw her, too. His eyes froze for a moment. Then he quickly looked down, ashamed, like a child caught in the act of doing something terrible. Sarfaraz didn't notice anything unusual. He called out hurriedly, "Mother! Bring some food and water for my friend." Jamila rushed off to prepare. Now, only Muskan, Sarfaraz, and Babar were left in the room. No one spoke. The air was suffocating, thick with tension. The ticking of the wall clock rang out like a death toll. Loud, sharp, unrelenting. Muskan stood frozen in place. It felt as if her skin was burning. The memories of that Mehndi night came flooding back. Clear, vivid, like they had just happened yesterday. Choked cries. The foul, metallic scent of damp soil. Babar's crazed, predatory eyes. His sickening, cruel laughter. Babar finally looked up, his eyes murky with pain. He opened his mouth, voice cracked and raspy. "Muskan. I'm sorry." Muskan clenched the fabric of her sleeve, her nails digging deep into her skin. She wanted to scream. To attack him. To curse him 1,000 times over. But all she could do was remain silent. A silence more brutal than any curse. Babar lowered his head even further, trembling. I know I can never undo what I did. But if I can, please, forgive me. Forgive. Muskan laughed bitterly inside. Forgive the man who killed her youth. Forgive the man who sentenced her to live half a life. In shame, in isolation, in endless darkness. But then she looked at Babar. No longer the monster he once was, but a crippled, hollow shell. A man whose body and soul had both withered and rotted. And in that moment, Muskan felt nothing. No hatred. No rage. Only disgust. And a cold, detached pity. She turned and walked away, saying nothing, leaving Babar to sit there alone, swallowed by the shadows of the hell he had created for himself. That night, Sarfaraz entered the room and found Muskan sitting motionless by the window. He hesitated. Babar, he's my oldest, dearest friend. Muskan gave a cold, bitter smile. A smile sharp as winter wind. Yes. Very dear. Sarfaraz didn't catch her tone. He sighed. He said he wanted to see you. To apologize, for the past. Muskan clenched her hand over her belly. She knew. Some wounds don't heal with apologies. But at least fate had delivered Babar his lesson. No crime escapes karma. In the days following that fateful encounter, Muskan moved like a ghost. In her mind, Babar's broken figure haunted her. Crippled, frail, his eyes wild like a drowning man. Not because she still hated him. Not because she still resented him. But because she felt empty. A vast emptiness that had stretched from that cursed Mehndi night all the way to this day. A void nothing could fill. Babar lay confined to the guest room. Sarfaraz cared for him daily, changing bandages, feeding him, washing him. Like a devoted brother. Muskan kept her distance. She avoided him like one avoids a dirty memory buried deep beneath layers of ash. But no matter how far you run, fate always finds a way to force confrontations you never wanted. One stormy night, Sarfaraz banged urgently on Muskan's door, panic in his voice. Muskan. Babar. Babar is dying. Muskan stared at him, her heart pounding. Without thinking, she ran after him toward the guest room. The lights were dim. The air smelled sharply of antiseptic. On the bed, Babar lay gasping. His eyes sunken. His bony hand trembling as it clutched the blanket. He murmured. Muskan. Muskan. Sarfaraz turned to her, eyes pleading. Please. At least hear him, just this once. Muskan slowly stepped toward the bed. When Babar saw her, a faint light flickered in his eyes. Like a dying traveler in the desert catching a glimpse of a distant mirage. He tried to raise his hand, but barely managed to lift it an inch. His voice was faint, broken, barely a whisper. I'm sorry. A single tear rolled down his hollow cheek. Muskan stood still, unmoving. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She was silent, like a stone statue, witnessing the final fall of a broken soul. Babar gasped, as if summoning his last breath. That night. It was my fault. I ruined your life. Please, forgive me. The words forgive me drifted into the air like his final breath. A crack of thunder exploded, rattling the window panes. Babar convulsed once, then went still. His eyes remained open, wide. As if searching for one final ounce of mercy before he was swallowed by eternal darkness. Sarfaraz leaned down, trembling, and checked for a pulse. A heavy shake of the head. Babar was gone. Taking with him all his sins, all the pain he'd inflicted. Muskan turned and walked out of the room, her thin shoulders trembling. She didn't cry. No. For someone like Babar, even tears were a gift. One she had no intention of giving. Outside, the rain poured down like a waterfall, turning the courtyard white with mist. Muskan stood under the awning, staring into the endless rain. Inside her, a storm raged just as fiercely. Hatred? Resentment? Pity? No. All of those emotions had died with Babar. Only one thing remained. Release. Muskan lifted her head. For the first time in what felt like eternity, she took a deep breath, welcoming the cool, clean air of the season's first rain. Raindrops splashed on her face, soaked her clothes, but she didn't care. She felt light, as if a 1,000-pound burden on her chest had finally been lifted. That night, Muskan sat by the window, gently rubbing her belly. The baby kicked, a soft, feeble thump full of life. She smiled. A real smile. Not forced. Not fake. For the first time in ages, Muskan felt she still had a future. At Babar's funeral, Sarfaraz sat numbly on the front steps, smoking one cigarette after another. Muskan stood at a distance, watching. She knew Sarfaraz wasn't a monster like Babar, but he had still hurt her. With his silence, his cold stares, his cruel words. That evening, when Sarfaraz returned to the room, he sat in front of Muskan and hesitated for a long time before speaking. "I'm sorry." Muskan looked at him, her eyes calm, like a lake after the storm. She nodded softly. No bitterness. No demands. Because she had learned something. Forgiveness isn't something you give because someone deserves it. Forgiveness is something you give to free yourself. If you're still watching this video and you admire Muskan's courage to forgive, please comment 5 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I encourage you to do so and click the bell. Your support helps us continue creating powerful stories to inform and inspire you. After Babar's death, the house fell into silence again. But it was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence it used to be. It was the kind of quiet that follows a storm. Wrecked, scattered, but clean. Raw. Ready for new life to grow. Muskan still rose early every day. She still swept the floors. Still cooked. Still folded laundry with her small, calloused hands, the hands of someone who had endured. But something had shifted in those movements. A softness. A quiet strength. A sliver of hope. Each evening, she sat by the window, holding her belly, singing lullabies her mother once sang to her. Each note, each word, like a seed planted in her soul, nurturing the dream of something new, something better. One day, while sweeping the yard, Muskan noticed a small flower blooming from a crack in the dry brick path. A delicate violet blossom, trembling in the wind. Fragile, but defiant. She knelt down and touched its soft petals with her fingertips, eyes blurring with tears. It was just like her. Crushed. Trampled. But still alive. Still fighting. Sarfaraz, too, had changed after Babar's death. He became quieter, less bitter. The venom in his words began to fade. He no longer avoided Muskan's gaze. No longer walked away when she entered the room. Some nights, he sat on the porch for hours, staring into the darkness, as if searching for a piece of his conscience he had long lost. One night, while Muskan was fussing over the bed sheet, Trying to smooth it out, Sarfaraz stepped into the room. He stood there for a long moment, silent, before speaking in a hoarse, low voice. "Muskan." She looked up. Their eyes met, no longer filled with hatred, no longer cold. Just the quiet awkwardness of two lost souls trying to find their way back. Sarfaraz slowly walked over and sat on the edge of the bed. He took a deep breath, as though summoning all his courage. "I've made so many mistakes." Muskan remained silent. She didn't need a confession. Didn't need to reopen old wounds. But even so, those words, though hesitant, though broken, were like a small flame warming a heart that had been cold for too long. Sarfaraz bowed his head. "I know I don't deserve anything. But if there's any kindness left in your heart, please, give me a chance. Not for me. For our child." When he said "our child," Muskan's throat tightened. Tears welled up, the first tears after countless days of silence. Not tears of sorrow. Not tears of despair. But the tears of a seed finally breaking open in frozen soil. She reached out with a trembling hand and placed it on his. No words were needed. That gentle touch said everything. Forgiveness. Acceptance. And a beginning. From that day forward, things in the house began to change. Not drastically. Not suddenly. But clearly. Sarfaraz started coming home earlier. He sat at the dinner table, listening to Muskan talk about little things. How the water jar broke, or how a baby sparrow got stuck in the chimney. Sometimes, he brought small gifts. A ripe mango. A new pair of slippers. A handful of wildflowers picked on his way home. No grand gestures. No flowery words. But to Muskan, those little things were more precious than all the jewels in the world. Even Jamila, her mother-in-law, softened. She no longer snapped at her or scrutinized every gesture. Some afternoons, Jamila would sit at the veranda, sewing and humming old folk songs. The house, once thick with bitterness and grief, now felt warmer, brighter. As if the sun had finally peeked out after an endless storm. Each morning, Muskan stood before the mirror, gently caressing her growing belly. She would whisper, "My love. We're going to have a real family. A real one." And for the first time, she believed it. She believed in it fiercely. Like believing the sun will rise every morning. Time passed quietly, like a small stream trickling through a peaceful valley. Muskan grew heavier, her belly round and full. A sweet fruit nearing harvest. In every step, in every gentle caress of her belly, she felt the tiny movements of the life growing inside her. Each time the baby kicked, she smiled. A soft, tearful smile full of faith. Sarfaraz had changed, too. He was no longer distant or cold. At night, he would sit beside Muskan, listening as she spoke. Sometimes, he'd place his hand on her belly. Startled by the soft kicks. His eyes lit with pure, wordless emotion Muskan had never seen in him before. One night, under the dim glow of the lamp, Sarfaraz sat silently, fingers laced together. Then, awkwardly, he said, "I will love this child, as if he were my own flesh and blood." Muskan looked up, eyes wide. He continued, his voice shaking. "I don't care where he came from. All I know is, he's ours." The words were few, but they shattered something in her. Not in pain, but in healing. No more hatred. No more past. Only the present. and the future waiting ahead. But joy, no matter how deep, always walks hand in hand with fear. The closer she got to her due date, the more a quiet unease crept into Muskan's heart. The first cramps came like whispers, gentle waves that warned of a storm approaching. One evening, with the moon hidden behind dark clouds, Muskan suddenly doubled over in pain. At first, it was mild. Then came wave after wave. Sharp, relentless, as though her small body was being torn apart. Jamila ran to fetch the midwife. Sarfaraz, pale and panicked, rushed about helplessly like a headless chicken. Muskan bit down on a cloth, sweat pouring from her body. Each contraction seared through her like fire in her veins. The midwife arrived and immediately took charge. Boil water. Where are the clean towels? Move quickly. The room became a silent battlefield, where Muskan fought between life and death. She writhed on the bed, clutching Sarfaraz's hand tightly. He leaned down, whispering in her ear, "You can do this, Muskan. I'm here." And in that moment, despite all the pain of the past, she knew they were truly together. A newborn's cry shattered the thick silence. Weak, fragile, but full of life. The midwife lifted the tiny, red-faced baby into the air, his wrinkled features and flailing arms still sticky with birth. "It's a boy," she exclaimed, joy lighting up her face. Sarfaraz stood frozen in place. He looked at the baby, then at Muskan, her face drenched in sweat, her chest heaving, but her eyes glowing with pure happiness. With trembling hands, he reached out and took the baby from the midwife. When the infant wrapped his tiny fingers around Sarfaraz's thumb, he couldn't hold back the tears. They slid down his sun-darkened cheeks, unstoppable. "Hello there, my son," he whispered, voice cracking under the weight of emotion. Muskan lay quietly, watching the scene unfold. Her heart brimmed with a feeling too big to name. The baby kicked, crying out, searching for warmth. Sarfaraz leaned down and placed a gentle kiss on the baby's forehead. A kiss that carried all the love he had to give. The room glowed with a strange light. Not from the lamps, nor the moon, but from love, forgiveness, and rebirth. Jamila wiped her tears and smiled. "This child, he will bring blessings to our whole family." And Muskan whispered silently in her heart, "Not just for the family, but for me, too. You are the light in the darkness of my life, my son." That night, when the world was finally still, Muskan cradled her baby in her arms. She stroked his soft skin, listened to the rhythmic beating of his tiny heart, and made a promise. "I will protect you, with all my life." A new beginning had come. No more shadows. No more sorrow. Only love, hope, and goodness waiting ahead. In the days after the baby's birth, the once quiet house filled with a new warmth. The cries of a newborn echoed each morning and night, like the opening notes of a new symphony. A symphony of hope and life. Muskan named him Ayan. A name meaning light, a radiant beginning after darkness. Each time she whispered it, it reminded her, no matter how dark the past, a single ray of light can brighten the entire sky. Raising a newborn was not easy, especially for a first-time mother like Muskan, and a clumsy, overwhelmed father like Sarfaraz. There were nights when Ayan wouldn't stop crying, his tiny face turning red from exhaustion. Muskan would pace for hours, her back soaked with sweat, arms aching. Sarfaraz stumbled around with bottles, diapers, blankets. Dropping everything, fumbling like a child himself. One night, Muskan collapsed onto the floor in tears, exhausted and overwhelmed. Sarfaraz rushed to her side, wrapped his arms around her trembling shoulders and said, his voice hoarse, "You don't have to do this alone, Muskan. I'm here. I'll learn with you." And just like that, a small door inside her opened. A door that led to trust, to partnership, to shared strength. From then on, Sarfaraz tried, one step at a time. He learned how to mix formula, even though he spilled half the can the first time. He learned how to change diapers, even if he accidentally put one on backward. He stayed up at night walking Ayan around the house, humming clumsy lullabies full of warmth. Muskan watched him with a strange, unfamiliar emotion. Not passion, not fiery love, but a deep, quiet peace. The kind she once believed she would never feel again. One morning, as the first pale light of dawn spilled through the window, Muskan awoke to see Sarfaraz asleep in the chair. Ayan curled safely in his arms. Father and son, both breathing in unison, both frowning slightly in dream. Muskan stood still, her heart softening like water. Maybe. Sometimes the most beautiful things come after the greatest pain. Jamila, too, had changed. She became gentler, more patient. Each time she held Ayan, she'd whisper, "My precious grandson. You'll bring peace to all of us." The deep wounds in their family, once buried under cold stares and harsh words, were slowly healing. Not through grand apologies, but through small, tender acts each day. One evening, as Muskan rocked Ayan to sleep, Sarfaraz sat down beside her. After a long pause, he spoke softly. "I know. I've hurt you a lot. If you'll allow me, teach me how to love again." Muskan looked up. Her eyes were full of tears. Not of despair, but of forgiveness. She nodded gently. No poetic words. No promises. Only one silent vow whispered from heart to heart. "Let's learn to love, together." The days passed in simple peace. Ayan grew each day, his tiny smile shining like sunlight straight into their hearts. Muskan slowly learned to let go of the past. Not by forgetting, but by placing it gently in a quiet corner of her soul. As part of her growth, she learned to smile for real, to open her heart, clumsily, cautiously, to love again. And Sarfaraz, once a man burdened by shame and silence, was becoming, day by day, a real husband, a real father, with all the sincerity and effort he could give. One afternoon, Muskan carried Ayan out into the yard. A gentle breeze rustled the treetops, carrying with it the earthy scent of soil after rain. Ayan giggled, waving his tiny hands in the air. Sarfaraz approached from behind and wrapped his arms around both mother and child. The three of them, standing under the soft glow of twilight, looked like a quiet, perfect painting. Muskan looked up and whispered, "Thank you, God, for not abandoning us in the dark." And in that moment, she knew something for sure. Even if storms return, even if darkness veils the sky once more, I will never be alone again. Because now, she had a family built from wounds, but burning bright and resilient like a flame that would never die. Peace was never meant to be permanent. It is as fragile as morning mist, a single cold gust could sweep it away. And for Muskan, that cold wind came just when she had started to believe she was truly happy. One early winter afternoon, As the sun cast its last weak rays over the old bamboo grove, an unexpected event shook the household. Jamila, Muskan's mother-in-law, was cleaning out the old storage room. While sorting through boxes, she stumbled upon a stack of yellowed letters tucked hastily inside a rusted tin box. The letters, written by Sarfaraz long ago, were addressed to a childhood friend. In them, line after line spilled out bitterness, shameful confessions, about his own impotence, the forced marriage, and the devastating secret. The child growing in Muskan's belly was not his by blood. Jamila, a woman who had lived her life by strict codes of honor, stood frozen amid the dust. Her hands trembled. Her heart pounded violently. This truth struck like lightning, shattering every beautiful illusion she had built about her daughter-in-law and her first grandchild. Without hesitation, she called for Sarfaraz and Muskan to come to the living room. The air was so tense it felt like even the walls were trembling. Muskan entered with Ayan in her arms, her face confused. Sarfaraz followed, his eyes darkening with dread. Jamila flung the stack of letters onto the table. Her voice, hoarse with rage. "Explain yourselves." Muskan froze. She recognized it instantly, the secret she had sworn to bury forever was now laid bare, harsh and unforgiving, under the light. Sarfaraz lowered his head. He clenched his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms, trying to summon the courage. Finally, he spoke, his voice rasping. "Mother. It's all my fault." Jamila's eyes blazed. "What are you saying? You mean, this child, he's not my grandchild?" She pointed at Ayan, the innocent baby who stared back at everyone with wide, curious eyes, not understanding a thing. Muskan clutched Ayan to her chest, tears pouring down her face and onto her baby's soft cheeks. Sarfaraz lifted his head, eyes steady. "That's right. But Ayan is my son. He is the blood of this family." Jamila collapsed into a chair as if all the strength had drained from her body. She exhaled heavily. "Why did you deceive me? Why keep something so horrible from me?" Her voice was filled with pain, not because of the baby, not because of the truth, but because of trust. The trust she had given them, now shattered like glass on cold stone. Muskan knelt at Jamila's feet, tears flooding her face. "Mother. Please, forgive us." She didn't try to explain. Didn't blame fate. There was only one raw, painful truth. She was wrong for staying silent. Even if it came from fear and despair, her silence had created a crack that would be hard to mend. Sarfaraz knelt beside her. He gripped her hand tightly, a silent vow. "No matter what, we'll face this together." Jamila looked at them. A couple, thin, battered by life, yet their eyes glowed with a bond that couldn't be broken. She looked at the baby in Muskan's arms, little Ayan, innocent, sucking his thumb, smiling. A long, aching silence filled the room. And finally, Jamila began to cry. Old, bitter, salty tears. But also tears that washed away a bitterness that had been buried for far too long. She choked out. "I don't care where he came from. He's here now. He's my grandson." Then Jamila opened her arms and reached for Ayan. The baby squealed with joy, his tiny arms waving in the air. The entire house seemed to light up. Not from lamps. Not from moonlight. But from the light of forgiveness. The light of love. That night, when everyone had gone to sleep, Muskan sat alone by the window. She looked up at the sky full of stars, her heart overwhelmed with gratitude. I was wrong to believe life was only darkness. The truth is, there is always light waiting at the end of the road, if we're brave enough to keep walking. In the days that followed the upheaval, something shifted in the air of Sarfaraz's home. There were no more suspicious glances. No more suffocating silences. Instead, there was Ayan's cheerful laughter, Muskan's quick, light footsteps, and Sarfaraz's calm, contemplative gaze. Jamila, once a stern, rigid woman, now carried Ayan around the courtyard each day, softly humming old lullabies. Each time she smiled, the deep lines on her face seemed to soften, like long-forgotten wounds finally beginning to heal. Muskan, though still startled at times by distant thunder or the howl of the wind, would look down at Ayan sleeping peacefully in her arms and whisper to herself, "I survived. I made it through." No more relentless nightmares. No more curling into herself at night, frozen to the bone. Each morning, she whispered thanks. For a new day. For the people beside her. For herself, for being strong enough not to break. Sarfaraz, once weighed down by shame and regret, had begun to rediscover himself. He worked harder. Spent more time with his family. Each evening, he lifted Ayan high into the air, spinning him gently while laughter filled the house. These small acts, to Muskan, were worth more than 1,000 promises. One day, as Muskan sat darning an old shirt for Ayan, Sarfaraz sat beside her. He clumsily took the needle from her hand, struggling for 5 whole minutes just to thread it. Muskan laughed. A clear, sparkling laugh, like wind chimes dancing in the breeze, her first in what felt like forever. Sarfaraz looked at her, his eyes shining. "I want to mend everything with you." That simple sentence, sincere and quiet, felt like a vow, needing no ceremony. Winter gave way to spring. Fresh buds pushed through the soil. Tiny blossoms bloomed in every corner of the garden. And in Muskan's heart, too, a new spring was blossoming. A spring of forgiveness, rebirth, and a quiet, enduring love. One morning, while hanging clothes in the courtyard, Muskan saw Ayan wobbling toward her on his first unsteady steps. He tumbled, rolled, then got up again, grinning from ear to ear. She dropped the cloth in her hand, rushed over, and swept him into her arms. And in that embrace, she felt the old pain had truly ended. A new journey had begun, one of courage, hope, and deep, unwavering love. That night, Sarfaraz laid out a small mat under the stars. He held Ayan between them, the soft moonlight bathing all three in a gentle silver glow. He placed his hand over Muskan's and whispered, "I can't promise I'll never hurt you again. But I do promise, every time you fall, I'll be the first one to help you stand." Muskan looked into his eyes. No words were needed. Her heart already knew the answer. A real family isn't one without mistakes or wounds. A real family is one that forgives, that chooses to love even through the hardest moments. Muskan looked up at the sky. The stars twinkled like tiny lanterns smiling down on her. And she whispered silently, "At last. After all those lost and broken nights, I've found my own light." The darkness of her past no longer haunted her. It had become just another chapter, one she had lived through bravely. Now, beside her were Sarfaraz, Ayan, and a family she had fought through blood, tears, and faith to build. And with every beat of her heart, every breath she took, she silently thanked life. Because in the end, the dawn always comes for those who are brave enough to walk through the night. That night, After Ayan had fallen asleep in his cradle, Muskan sat alone by the window. The spring sky stretched high and wide, dusted with stars like someone had scattered pure light across velvet. The moonlight brushed her hair in silver, as if it, too, was gently stroking away the old pain. She closed her eyes, listened to the baby's steady breathing, and to the soft rhythm of her own heart. Memories returned. Her carefree childhood, the nightmare of her wedding night, the endless lonely darkness, the hesitant mornings that followed. Long ago, she would have cursed fate for all of it. But now, Muskan simply smiled. A soft smile, like the breeze through leaves. Because now she knew, if not for the night, we would never learn to treasure the light. If not for the loneliness, we'd never discover the strength to rise alone. Life, after all, is not a straight path lined with roses. It's unexpected turns, deep pits, violent storms. But it's also in those moments of despair that we discover the greatest strength. Not the strength to conquer others, but the strength to conquer the darkness within ourselves. Muskan opened her eyes and gazed up at the starlit sky. She whispered, as if sending a prayer from the deepest part of her soul. If you are walking through darkness, don't be afraid. Darkness is not where you're meant to stay forever. It's just a resting place, where you learn to recognize the light when it comes. If you're hurting, don't hide your tears. Tears don't make you weak. They make space inside your heart, space for hope to take root. If you've fallen, don't blame yourself. Remember, every scar on your heart is a mark of a battle you survived. She placed her hand gently over her chest, feeling the strong, steady beat within. There was a time she thought this heart had shattered too deeply to love again. But the human heart, she learned, can mend itself with invisible threads, called hope and faith. And when it heals, it beats even stronger than before. Muskan smiled. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. Not tears of pain, but tears of growth, of gratitude, of a vast, imperfect, unwavering love for life itself. She looked over at Ayan, sleeping soundly in his tiny cradle, cheeks warm and pink with peace. This was her future. This was the light she had earned, by walking bravely through so many nights. She knew there would be more hard days ahead. More trials. More stumbles. But this time, she would not be afraid. Because now she knew. I am not alone. I have my child. I have a family. And most importantly, I have myself. And if anyone out there is reading this story tonight, Muskan would want to offer you a quiet, gentle message. Don't let go in the dark. Because the dawn is always just beyond it. You deserve light. You deserve love. You deserve all that is beautiful. As long as you don't give up. She closed the window softly. Night had deepened. In the quiet room, beside the steady breath of a sleeping child, a soft hum rose, warm as a lullaby, gentle as a prayer. Tomorrow will be better. Because I dared to walk through the night. Thank you for joining us today. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share. What did this story teach you? And how will you carry its message into your life? Your voice matters. Reading your reflections brings strength, healing, and inspiration to us all. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue crafting stories that awaken the soul. Thank you for watching. And we'll see you in the next video.